If what ye say be true, then the souls of men seek not the dismal homes of Erebus, but the breath of life still rules these bodies in another age. Life on this hand, and on this hand, and death in between. Lucan's Pharsalia, and that's what we'll be discussing today. The Pharsalia is a poem written by Lucan during the reign of Nero in 61 AD. Now this poem was 10 books long, and for the day you may think of a poem more as a play, something to be performed. But in antiquity, these were still referred to as poems, and this poem details the civil war between Julius Caesar and Rome that took place in 58 BC, when Caesar turned his troops around to cross the Rubicon and march against Rome. Well, you now may be saying, well, this is a poem written in 61 AD about the civil war in 58 BC. I mean, how much historical relevance can this really have? So the point I'd like to make is that we're interested in the narratives from those people that knew the Druids, that they were within living memory or within a generation of living memory when they wrote these texts. And we should understand that this was written in 61 AD, and the attack to wipe out the Druids on the Battle of Anismore on the island now known as Anglesey was in the same year. It's estimated that attack on Anismore was held somewhere between 60 and 61 AD. As to whether or not Lucan actually met any Druids, well, I can't say, but one thing's for sure. He certainly had a better idea of what the Druids were about then than we do today. So, with that in mind, let's get back on to the poem. And the books we're interested in are books 1 and 3. Now, in the first book, we're told how Caesar is the general in charge of all the armies of Gaul, and his forces are subduing the Celtic tribes of Gaul. And there's a chapter in this book called Caesar Gathers His Forces. And in this chapter, it describes the Gaulish tribes that are being subdued by the Roman forces. Now, I should also mention that there are a number of these translations available, and I've chosen 2. And the reason I've chosen 2 is that where one is a little vague, then the other can add a little bit more light on the subject. So the 2 translations I've chosen are one by H.T. Riley that was published in 1853, and one that was published by Sir Edward Ridley in 1919. And these complement each other quite well. So what I'll be doing is to read the translations from my monitor. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm not looking directly at the camera. And while reading through the translations, I'll be stopping to add some explanatory commentary. So let's get on with it. So this first section, as I've already mentioned, comes from the first book, and the chapter called Caesar Gathers His Forces. And what Lucan's doing here is describing the Celtic tribes who were once subdued by the Romans, but now the Romans have left their posts to gather together to march against Rome. And so this is the description he gives of some of the Celts and makes some mentions of the Druids. Thou too, O Treviri, rejoicest that the war has left thy bounds. Ligurian tribes now shown in ancient days were first of the long-haired nations, on whose necks once flowed the auburn locks in pride supreme. And those who pacify with blood accursed savage Teutates, Esus, horrid shrines, and Taranis, altars cruel as were those loved by Diana, goddess of the north. All these now rest in peace. Okay, so I want to switch now to the second translation, which sheds a little bit more light on what we've just said. So, with this one, we have, Thou too, Treviri, overjoyed that the course of warfare is turned back, and thou, Ligurian, now shorn in former times with thy locks hanging down thy graceful neck, preferred to the hool of the long-haired Gaul. Those two by whom the relentless Teutates is appeased by direful bloodshed, and Esus, dreadful with his merciless altars, and the shrine of Taranis, no more humane than that of the Scythian Diana. So I think that translation makes it a little bit more clear. He's talking about the Trevis and the Ligurians, how they're happy that Rome and the battle between the Romans and themselves is over, and he's also telling us how they worship the gods Esus, Teutates, and Taranis. Okay, so now we'll switch back to Riley and continue reading. You too, ye bards, who as poets hand down high your praises to remote ages, spirits valiant, and cut off in war, freed from alarm, did then pour forth full many a strain, and you, Druids, after arms were laid aside, sought once again your barbarous ceremonials and the ruthless usages of your sacred rites. To you alone it has been granted to know the gods and the divinities of heaven, or alone to know that they do not exist. So here he's now talking about the bards and the druids, and he's telling us how the bards sing their praises of the ancestors, of their battles and their valiant fights. And he's telling us of the Druids and how the Druids, that now these battles and the Roman subjection has been left, that they've returned back to what he says is their barbarous rites. Oh, and in that last sentence, he also tells us that it's only to the Druids that know the gods, know the Celtic gods, or can converse with the Celtic gods. So, continuing on for this last chapter, in the remote forest you inhabit the deep glades. On your authority the shade seek not the silent abodes of Erebus. Now, I think I can clarify that translation from what I've seen in other places. And I think what this really is supposed to be saying, on your authority, the souls of men do not seek the silent abodes of Erebus. And Erebus is the Greek god of the dark half of the underworld. And so what he's saying is that when men die, they're not expecting to go to death and stay in the darkness of the underworld. And we'll see just exactly what it is that he says they are expecting in a second. So, on your authority, the souls of men do not seek the silent abodes of Erebus and the pallid realms of Pluto in the depths below. So, again, just as I said earlier, and it's reinforced with the Roman god Pluto, who's the god of the darkness. So, let's carry on. The same spirit controls other limbs in another world. Death is the mid-space in a prolonged existence. If you sing what it is ascertained as the truth, assuredly the nations whom the northern bear looks down upon are happy in their error, whom this, the very greatest of terrors, does not move, fear of death, thence have the people's spirits ever ready to rush to arms and souls that welcome death. So that was a bit of a cryptic mouthful, wasn't it? Let's move on and have a look at the second translation by Ridley, and I think we'll get some more clarity with that. So we'll pick up here with, if what he sing be true, then the shades of men seek not the dismal homes of Erebus or death's pale kingdoms, but the breath of life still rules their bodies in another age, life on this hand and that hand, and death in between. So I've already explained the first part of that chapter, and the second part, he's clearly talking about reincarnation. He's saying that the breath of life still rules these bodies in another age, so they don't go and seek the shadows of Erebus, but the breath of life still retains itself and is reincarnated in another body, in another age. And so, in the last sentence, life in this hand and that, and death in between. And now this last part. Happy the peoples neath the northern star in their false belief. For them no fear of that which frights all others. They with hands and hearts undaunted rush upon the foe and scorn to spare the life that shall return. So what's meant by that? What they're saying is because they believe in reincarnation, they've got no fear of death. And as such, they also don't spare others the fate of death. For them, death was the end of one chapter and the start of a new one. So here we've learned about the Trevis and the Ligurians and their worship of the Gods Teutates, Esus and Taranis, and their sacrifices to him. And we've also been told about the bards, how they sing the songs of valour, and the Druids, how it's only they that know the gods, and it's them that conduct the sacrifices and speak to the gods. And we've also learned of their belief in reincarnation and why the Celts were not afraid to die. So the next section to look at comes from Book 3, and it's the chapter called Caesar Clears a Sacred Grove. So in this section, Caesar's looking for materials to build some fortifications for an attack on a city that is now Marseille. And as they've cleared all the woodland in the surrounding areas, the only place left to get these materials is a sacred grove. Hard by, there was a grove which through long centuries no hand of man had dared to violate. Hidden from the sun, its chill recesses, matted bounds entwined, imprisoned the air within. No sylvan nymphs here found a home, no Pan but savage rites and barbarous worship. And by sylvan nymphs he'd be speaking about the god Silvanus, the god of the wild. But savage rites and barbarous worship on altars horrible on crimson basements, with the blood of man each tree was sanctified. So he's talking about sacrifice, and he's saying that each tree was covered in the blood of men from these sacrifices. If faith be given to ancient myth, then no fowl has ever dared to rest upon those branches, and no beast has made his lair beneath. No lightning flash bursts from the tempest cloud. The breathless air stirs not the leaves, yet trembling they betray a horror of their own. From sable fonts dripped frequent waters, effigies of the gods rude, scarcely fashioned from some fallen stem, held the mid-space. And pallid with decay, their rotting shapes struck terror. Thus do men dread most the god unknown. So, what he's talking about here is the fearsome effigies of the gods and the fallen stem that held the mid-space. Well, I don't think you need me to clarify what that means. It was said that the caves rumbled with earthquakes, that the prostrate yew rose up again, that fiery tongues of flame gleamed in the forest depths, yet the trees were unkindled, and that snakes in frequent folds were coiled around their trunks. And if we go back to what Riley says about them, then the caverns roared amid the earthquake, and the yews that had fallen rose again, and the flames shone from a grove that did not burn, and that serpents embracing the oaks were entwined around them. So that might add a little bit more clarity. The people throng that place with no approaching worship, but have left it to the gods. When Phoebus is in the mid-sky, or the dark night possesses the heavens, the priest himself dreads the approach and is afraid to meet with the guardian of the grove. So Phoebus is another name for Apollo, the god of the sun. And what's being said here is that when Phoebus is highest in the sky, so that's around midday, and at the darkest hours of night, then nobody would dare to walk this grove for fear that they would come across this god, this guardian of the grove. So this chapter gives us an image of a Druidic grove and the rites carried out there from a Roman perspective. But we must take into account that the Romans were biased and they didn't like the Druids. But this is the kind of general perception that we can see that the Roman people had of the Druids. So that's all there is about the Druids from the Pharsalia. And I hope you enjoyed today's little discussion. And if you have, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. And with that, I'll see you again in another 2 weeks on the next episode.